My name is Claire, and I will never forget the night I was publicly stripped of my dignity in front of 23 wealthy strangers. Imagine this, a grand dining hall with chandeliers brighter than the stars, polished silver cutlery lined up like soldiers, and crystal glasses that caught the light in 100 tiny rainbows. Everyone was dressed in designer suits and gowns that probably cost more than my annual rent. And me, I sat there in a borrowed blue dress, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out the laughter around me. Then it happened. The man at the head of the table, my boyfriend's father, Richard Montgomery, a billionaire known for his ruthless empire, leaned forward with an expression that could freeze blood. He looked at me, his gaze slicing through my borrowed confidence, and he sneered loudly enough for the entire room to hear street garbage in a borrowed dress. The air was sucked out of the room, every clink of cutlery stopped. A few guests tried to hide their shock behind their wine glasses, but I could feel all 23 pairs of eyes boring into me, dissecting me, waiting for me to crumble. Across the table, Richard's smirk deepened, feeding off my humiliation. My blood turned to ice. I had prepared for awkwardness, for subtle jabs, maybe even thinly veiled condescension. But not this. Not an open assault in front of everyone. My boyfriend Ethan, sitting beside me, squeezed my hand under the table so tightly it almost hurt, as if trying to anchor me to keep me from shattering right there. His jaw was clenched, his knuckles white, but he didn't dare speak, not yet. I felt my face burning, but strangely, instead of tears, something else stirred inside me. It was like a lifetime of small humiliations, of being underestimated, of scraping my way through life, suddenly came rushing back in one tidal wave. My chest tightened, but it wasn't fear, it was resolve. In that moment, I understood this wasn't just dinner. This was a battle. Richard Montgomery wanted me broken, reduced to nothing in the eyes of his powerful guests. He wanted me to leave Ethan's side, with my head bowed, a silent confirmation that he was right, that love couldn't cross the invisible line between wealth and poverty. But as I sat there gripping Ethan's hand, I silently promised myself something else. If Richard thought he had cornered me, he was about to learn what happens when you try to burn someone who has nothing left to lose. The silence stretched, and I could almost hear the pounding of my own heart echoing off the marble walls. 23 guests waited. Richard Montgomery waited. And me. I was about to make a choice that would change everything, not just for me, not just for Ethan, but for the empire that man had built on arrogance and lies. This was the night I learned that sometimes being called garbage is the spark that reveals you've been gold all along. I need to take you back 7 months before that humiliating dinner, to the moment when my story with Ethan first began. Because the truth is, if you only saw me that night at the Montgomery estate, you'd never understand how two people from opposite worlds ended up sitting at the same table. And trust me, it wasn't because I chased wealth or privilege. It was because of one small coffee shop and the way a stranger treated me differently from everyone else. At that time, I was 30 years old, juggling 2 lives. By day, I worked at a little corner cafe on Maple Street in downtown Boston. It wasn't glamorous. My uniform always smelled faintly of espresso, and the soles of my shoes were worn from endless shifts. But the cafe gave me flexible hours, enough to cover my bills while I pursued my real passion, finishing my degree in graphic design at night classes. Some weeks, I had to choose between paying the electricity or buying textbooks. Most people never saw that struggle, but it was the reality I carried every day. And then Ethan walked in. He came in every morning at exactly 7:30, always ordering a black coffee with 1 sugar. At first, he was just another customer in a suit, another blur in a city full of them. But the difference, Ethan looked at me. He didn't stare through me the way most executives did, eyes glued to their phones while they barked orders for lattes. He said please and thank you. He tipped generously, and his smile, soft, genuine with those crinkles by the corners of his blue eyes, had a way of cutting through the gray monotony of my mornings. One day, after weeks of his quiet routine, I teased, "You must really like our coffee." It was my attempt at small talk, but he looked up from his laptop and said, "The coffee's good, but it's the atmosphere and the service that keep me coming back." His eyes lingered on mine just long enough to make me blush. That was the first time I realized this man wasn't just polite, he saw me. Soon our interactions grew longer. During my breaks, he'd ask questions that no one else cared to ask. Where was I from? What brought me to Boston? What did I dream about outside of the cafe? I told him pieces of my story about growing up in a small Ohio town with a single mother who worked 3 jobs about the nights when I did homework by candlelight because the power had been shut off. I didn't tell him everything, the missed meals, the quiet shame, but he listened with a kind of admiration that was almost disarming. "That takes incredible determination," he said once, his voice low and sincere. "Most people I know, they never had to fight that hard for anything." He admitted that his own life had been full of advantages, that things were handed to him more often than earned. That was the first hint he came from money, though at the time I had no idea just how much. Weeks later, he finally asked me to dinner, not at some flashy place with Michelin stars, but a cozy Italian restaurant tucked away on a side street. The conversation flowed as easily as the wine, and I remember thinking, this is different, this is real. By the end of the night, when I went home and Googled his last name, my stomach dropped. Ethan Montgomery wasn't just some kind-eyed businessman. He was the heir to Montgomery Global, a company worth billions, a family name splashed across business magazines. For a moment, I panicked. We lived in different universes. He had grown up with ski trips in the Alps, while I celebrated when I could afford a $50 bonus check. My instinct was to cut things off to protect myself from heartbreak. But then, he called the next day, his voice warm, steady, and genuine. "I had a wonderful time," he said, and against every bit of logic, I agreed to see him again. And that was how our story began, not with money or glamour, but with kindness, eye contact, and the simple act of being seen. And before I go further, let me ask you, have you ever met someone who completely shifted the direction of your life just by treating you differently? Share your story in the comments. And if you want to follow the rest of this journey, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because what happened next will leave you breathless. From that second dinner onward, something shifted between us. Ethan wasn't just a polite stranger in a suit anymore. He became someone who seemed genuinely curious about who I was beyond the apron and coffee counter. And that curiosity, it made me let down walls I didn't even realize I had built. Over the following weeks, he lingered longer after ordering his black coffee. Sometimes he'd slide his laptop aside and just talk with me. Other times, he'd wait until my break and insist on buying me a sandwich so we could sit outside on the bench near the cafe. He asked about my design projects, flipping through my sketchbook with an interest that felt different. He didn't pat me on the head and say, "That's cute." Instead, he looked at my ideas for logos and layouts as if they mattered. "You have real talent, Claire," he said once, tracing a finger over one of my drafts. "Most companies would be lucky to have this kind of vision." It was the way he said it, like it wasn't a compliment to make me feel better, but a statement of fact that made my chest tighten. I wasn't used to that. I wasn't used to being valued. For years, my life had been about survival, stacking 2 or 3 jobs, cramming night classes in between shifts, juggling bills like they were knives. My worth was measured in tips and test scores, not in my potential. But Ethan made me feel seen, as though all those late nights and sacrifices actually added up to something that mattered. And it wasn't just his words. Ethan showed it in small, consistent ways. He never rushed me, even though I knew his time was worth more in a single meeting than I made in a week. He listened, really listened, when I told stories about my hometown, or when I admitted how hard it was to choose between groceries and textbooks some semesters. He didn't flinch at the ugliness of my truth. He just looked at me with those calm blue eyes and said, "You're stronger than you realize." That strength was something I'd never thought of as valuable. Growing up, it had just been necessary, but Ethan made me believe maybe resilience could be beautiful. Still, there were cracks where our different worlds showed through. He'd mention childhood ski trips in Switzerland, or summers spent sailing off Nantucket, and I'd nod politely, unable to imagine that life. Meanwhile, I'd get giddy over finding $20 in an old jacket pocket, and he'd smile, baffled at my excitement. Yet instead of making me feel small, those moments turned into lessons. He asked questions. He wanted to understand. One evening stands out. We were walking along the Charles River, the city lights reflecting in the water, when he suddenly stopped, took a deep breath, and said, "I love you." There was no expensive gesture, no diamond ring, no dramatic setup. Just his voice steady and real caring words. I never expected to hear from someone like him. For a second I froze. A lifetime of insecurity screamed that I wasn't enough, that this man belonged to a world that would chew me up and spit me out. But then I looked at him, the sincerity in his eyes, the way he had never once treated me as less, and I realized I loved him too. Not because of his name, not because of what he could give me, but because of the way he made me feel like I belonged. From then on, it felt like we were building something sacred, a bubble untouched by the chaos of our different backgrounds. 6 months of late-night conversations, cheap diners, fancy restaurants, and countless cups of coffee stitched us together into something neither of us wanted to lose. But in the back of my mind there was always a whisper. How long can this last before reality catches up? And as you'll see, reality didn't just catch up, it crashed down like a storm I never saw coming. The night I discovered who Ethan really was still plays in my head, like a scene from a movie I never agreed to star in. Up until then, he'd been my gentle constant, the man who valued my sketches, who remembered how I liked my tea, who laughed at my terrible puns, even when no one else would. But one evening, after another long dinner, filled with laughter and conversation that felt too good to be real, I made the mistake of typing his last name into Google. Montgomery. The search results flooded my screen headlines about boardroom victories, glossy magazine covers with Richard Montgomery's steel gray stare stories about billion-dollar mergers. And tucked between all those financial triumphs was Ethan, younger in photos, but unmistakable smiling, next to his father at charity galas, shaking hands with senators standing in front of the Montgomery Global logo. My heart sank. The man who had been sitting across from me in dimly lit restaurants, who talked about art and music, and his dreams of starting something meaningful, that man was also the heir to one of the most ruthless industrial empires in America. I slammed my laptop shut, my stomach churning. Everything suddenly felt like a trick. Had he chosen me because I was different from his world, some novelty he could experiment with before returning to his real life of yachts and penthouses? I wanted to believe otherwise. But the gulf between our realities yawned open, threatening to swallow me whole. That night, I nearly texted him to cancel our next date. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, drafting and deleting the words, "I don't think this can work." But before I could send it, my phone buzzed. "Claire, I just wanted to say, tonight was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you." The sincerity in his voice unraveled me. I closed my eyes and listened to him talk, his tone warm and unguarded, and I realized something important. Ethan had never once treated me as though I were beneath him. He hadn't flaunted his wealth, hadn't tossed his last name around like a weapon. If anything, he had hidden it. Against all logic, against every self-preservation instinct screaming inside me, I said yes when he asked if he could see me again. And from that moment, I made a choice. I wouldn't judge Ethan by his father's empire, at least not yet. I would judge him by the man who sat in front of me, who brought me soup when I was sick, who remembered my sister's name after hearing it once. But make no mistake, I carried the knowledge of who he was like a weight in my chest. Every time we sat at a diner booth laughing over greasy fries, I wondered how it would look to the world if they knew. Every time he kissed me goodnight outside my tiny apartment, I thought of his family mansion somewhere across the city. And yet Ethan never made me feel out of place. If anything, he worked harder to prove that our worlds didn't have to collide. He told me he wanted to build something on his own, not live forever in his father's shadow. He even joked about quitting it all to open a bookstore cafe with me one day. I laughed at the time, but secretly I clung to the image. Still, reality has a way of creeping in no matter how tightly you try to seal the bubble. And deep down, I knew the bubble would burst. I knew the day would come when the Montgomery name would step between us like a wall neither of us could climb. That day was closer than I realized. For the next 6 months, life with Ethan felt like living inside a fragile but beautiful bubble. It wasn't that we ignored the differences between our backgrounds, they surfaced often enough, but somehow we always managed to smooth them over with laughter, patience, and a kind of tenderness I had never known before. We spent evenings walking along the Charles River, sometimes stopping at food trucks for greasy tacos, other times sitting in upscale restaurants where the waiters wore tuxedos. The beauty of it was that Ethan never seemed to prefer one over the other. He looked just as content, wiping salsa off his sleeve, as he did swirling a glass of wine worth more than my monthly rent. With him, the setting didn't matter. What mattered was that we were together. He encouraged me with my design projects in ways no one else ever had. When I was too tired from double shifts to open my laptop, he'd coax me gently. Just show me one sketch. I want to see what you've been working on. And when I did, his praise wasn't empty. He'd point out details, asking questions like he truly understood the effort behind every line, every color choice. He even offered to introduce me to people in his company's marketing department, though I hesitated. I wanted to succeed on my own merit, not because of his last name. Of course, there were moments that exposed the chasm between us. I still remember one night when my cafe manager surprised me with a $50 bonus. I rushed to tell Ethan, beaming with pride. He smiled back, but I caught the flicker of confusion in his eyes. For him, $50 was a casual tip, not a reward worth celebrating. Yet when he saw how much it meant to me, he leaned into my excitement, taking me out for ice cream to toast to my promotion. That was Ethan, always willing to meet me where I was. And then there were the stories of his childhood, skiing in the Alps, summers on a yacht in the Mediterranean, boarding schools with names I'd only ever read in novels. At first, those stories made me feel like an outsider in his world, someone peeking through a window into a life I'd never touch. But instead of letting that distance grow, Ethan would pause and say, "I didn't realize how different it was until I met you. Tell me more about Ohio. Tell me what it was like growing up there." So I did. I told him about my mother, who worked 3 jobs after my father left. About the nights when my sister and I did homework by candlelight because the power had been cut off. About the endless cycle of bills and survival that had shaped every part of me. And instead of pity, Ethan responded with respect. "Your mother sounds incredible," he said once. "You are who you are because of her strength." Those 6 months taught me something I'd never believed before, that love could actually bridge worlds. It wasn't just attraction or novelty, it was building something real out of trust, patience, and shared dreams. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, the bubble we were living in wasn't as fragile as I feared. Maybe we were stronger than the forces waiting outside of it. But still a small voice inside whispered, "How long can this last before someone pops it? And maybe I should ask you something now. If you were in my place, would you believe love could survive such a gulf? Or would you have walked away before it got harder? I'd love to know what you think." Because as you'll see, love wasn't the problem. The problem was the world. Ethan came from a world that wasn't going to let me stay invisible for long. The invitation came on a rainy Tuesday evening in April, and I swear my stomach hasn't unclenched since. Ethan and I were curled up on my old thrift store couch, a carton of takeout between us, watching some classic black and white film I'd borrowed from the library. It was one of those perfectly ordinary nights that made me feel safe. No grandeur, no pressure, just us. Then he muted the television, turned to me, and said words that made my fork freeze mid-air. "My grandparents are celebrating their 60th wedding anniversary next month. There's going to be a formal dinner at the estate. I want you to come with me." I blinked. "Your family estate? You mean meet everyone?" He nodded, his smile both hopeful and a little nervous. "It's a big deal, I know, but we've been together for 6 months. You're important to me, Claire. I want them to know you." My throat tightened. The thought of walking into a mansion full of people with last names engraved on skyscrapers was enough to make me want to hide under that couch cushion. But I saw the sincerity in his eyes, the unshakable belief that I belonged at his side. So I said yes, even as a part of me whispered that I'd just signed up for battle. From that moment on, preparation consumed me. What would I wear? How should I act? What if I used the wrong fork or mispronounced someone's name? The Montgomerys weren't just wealthy, they were old money wealthy. Their kind lived by unspoken codes I'd never been taught. The following weekend, I unloaded my panic on my best friend Sophia over lattes. She listened with a smirk before declaring, "You need a killer dress. Something that makes you feel untouchable." We scoured department stores for hours, but everything remotely appropriate cost more than my monthly rent. Just when despair was about to swallow me, Sophia grinned. "I still have that midnight blue silk gown from my cousin's wedding. With a few alterations, it's perfect for you." "I can't borrow your dress," I protested weakly, but even as I said it, relief washed over me. "Of course you can," she insisted. "And my pearl earrings, too. You're going to look stunning." In the weeks leading up to the dinner, I became a student again. I practiced walking in heels around my apartment until my feet blistered. I binged YouTube tutorials on formal dining etiquette, memorizing which fork matched which course. I even researched Montgomery Global's history, so I'd sound intelligent if conversation turned to the family empire. The night before the event, my sister called. Elaine had always been my rock, the one who helped raise me after Dad left, the one who knew every scar I carried. She listened quietly before saying, "Remember who you are. You are smart, kind, and worthy of respect. No amount of money changes that. Don't let anyone make you feel small." Her words steadied me like armor. On the night itself, as I slipped into the borrowed gown and fastened Sophia's pearls, I hardly recognized the reflection staring back at me. The dress hugged my frame like it was made for me, the fabric flowing with an elegance I'd never worn before. When Ethan arrived, he froze in the doorway. "You look breathtaking," he whispered, and for a moment, all my nerves melted. Outside, a sleek black sedan waited, his family's chauffeur-driven car replacing the modest vehicle he usually used. As we slid into the leather seats, Ethan squeezed my hand. "They're just people," he reassured me. "Wealthy, yes, but people with flaws and fears like anyone else. Just be yourself." I tried to believe him, but as the car rolled past increasingly opulent neighborhoods winding down a private road lined with towering oaks, my chest tightened. And when the Montgomery estate finally came into view, an architectural masterpiece with manicured gardens and stone lions guarding its entrance, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't just dinner, this was an audition. And as I would soon learn, the judges weren't all rooting for me. Tell me, have you ever walked into a room knowing every eye would be measuring you, waiting for you to slip? Drop your story in the comments. I'd love to hear how you handled it. The night of the Montgomery anniversary dinner felt like stepping into another universe. As our car rolled through the iron gates, I saw the mansion rise from the darkness like a palace, its windows glowing with warm golden light. The driveway curved around manicured gardens and marble fountains, and at the entrance, liveried valets waited to take keys from cars that probably cost more than my entire college tuition. My palms were slick against Ethan's as we stepped out. "Ready," he whispered. "No," I thought, not in the slightest, but I forced a smile and nodded. The massive double doors opened, and I felt as if I had walked into a period drama. The grand foyer was bigger than the entire building where my apartment sat. Above us hung a chandelier so massive it looked like it could light an opera house, crystals scattering light across Renaissance-style murals painted on the ceiling. The air smelled of roses and wealth. A woman swept toward us, elegant in a floor-length gown, silver blonde hair arranged in a perfect twist. "Ethan, darling." She kissed both his cheeks before her eyes flicked to me. Her smile was polite, brittle. "Mother, this is Claire," Ethan said, resting his hand lightly against my back. I extended mine. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Montgomery. Thank you for including me tonight." Her handshake was brief, her voice cool. "Of course. Ethan has mentioned you." The way she emphasized mention told me exactly how little she thought of those mentions. Then her gaze swept over my gown. What a bold color for spring. A compliment disguised as critique. Before I could respond, another voice broke in, bright and warm. "Finally. So you're the woman who got my brother to stop dating those dreadful socialites." A younger woman practically bounded into me, wrapping me in a hug before I had time to register. "I'm Lila, the fun sibling." "Come on, let me show you the only people here worth talking to." I shot Ethan a look. He just laughed softly. "That's Lila. She lacks subtlety." Arm in arm with Lila, I was pulled through a crowd of impeccably dressed guests, all of whom gave me quick, appraising glances. Their questions came sharp and sweet like poisoned candy. "And what do you do?" When I explained that I worked at a coffee shop while finishing my degree, their smiles tightened. "How quaint," one woman said, dripping in diamonds. Another murmured, "Ethan always did have a charitable heart," loud enough for me to hear. It was like being a curiosity in a museum exhibit. Look, a real working-class girl among us. My cheeks burned, but Lila squeezed my arm and muttered, "Ignore them. You've got more personality than this whole ballroom combined." There were exceptions. Ethan's grandparents, the guests of honor, welcomed me with such warmth it nearly made me cry. His grandfather clasped my hand and said, "So you're the young woman who puts that genuine smile on Ethan's face." "Wonderful to meet you, my dear," his grandmother added. "Ethan tells us you're studying design. You'll have to show me your work sometime." Their kindness felt like a lifeline in a sea of judgment. But the reprieve didn't last. Every time I turned, I felt the weight of someone's eyes on me, measuring, evaluating, deciding if I was worthy. Their words were subtle, but the meaning was clear. I was an outsider. I did not belong. The worst was yet to come. Across the room, I spotted him, Richard Montgomery himself. Tall, commanding, with Ethan's blue eyes stripped of all warmth. He stood surrounded by men in tailored suits, his laugh sharp, his presence magnetic. Even before he turned toward us, my stomach twisted. This was the man whose approval or rejection could shatter everything. And though I didn't know it yet, his words later that evening would do far more than humiliate me. They would ignite something inside me that had been waiting my whole life to rise. Richard Montgomery didn't so much greet me as he assessed me. Ethan guided me toward him, his hand, a steady weight against my back, but every step closer felt like approaching a lion in its den. Richard's laughter died the moment his sharp eyes fell on me. He scanned me from head to toe in a single sweep that made me want to shrink into the floor. Father Ethan began cautiously, "I'd like you to meet Claire." I extended my hand, my voice as even as I could manage. "It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Montgomery." He took it briefly, his grip so firm it bordered on punishing. "Indeed," he said, dismissing me in one word before turning back to the conversation he'd been having about stock prices. I should have been relieved when the dinner bell chimed, pulling us toward the long mahogany table, but dread settled over me instead. When I saw the seating chart, my worst fear was confirmed. I had been placed directly across from Richard, as if someone had arranged it on purpose. The dining room glittered under another chandelier, the table set with china so fine I was terrified of touching it. Ethan whispered jokes to calm me, but as soon as we sat down, Richard's presence loomed like a storm cloud. For a while, I kept quiet, watching others to know which spoon to use, trying desperately not to stumble. Conversations floated around me about private schools, yacht trips, hedge funds, topics designed to remind me I didn't belong. And then Richard struck. "So, Miss Claire," he said, his voice slicing through the chatter, "Ethan tells me you work in a coffee shop." Every head turned, my throat tightened, but I forced myself to answer. "Yes, sir, Maple Street Cafe. It helps pay for my education." He raised one eyebrow. "And what is it you're studying? Something practical, I hope." "Graphic design. I'll graduate next spring." "Graphic design," his lips curled, "making posters and such." Before I could answer, Ethan cut in. "She's extremely talented, Father. Her work is about brand identity, digital strategy." But Richard ignored him, his gaze still locked on me. "And where did you say you're from originally?" "A small town in Ohio." "Never heard of it." "And your father?" The question was a blade deliberate. Ethan tensed beside me, but I answered evenly. "He left when I was young. My mother raised us. She worked whatever job she could, retail, cleaning houses, waiting tables." Somewhere down the table, Ethan's grandmother murmured approvingly, "A strong woman." But Richard smirked, his voice dripping with disdain. "Indeed. From service work to service work through the generations. Fascinating." Ethan slammed his fork down harder than necessary. "Claire's mother made sacrifices most people could never imagine. She should be admired, not condescended to." The conversation limped on, but Richard wasn't finished. Between courses, he lobbed more questions, each one tipped with venom disguised as curiosity. "Did you attend university right after high school? Or did you only discover your intellectual curiosity later in life? That accent of yours rather provincial, isn't it? Is that common where you come from? Have you ever been to Europe? No, a pity. Travel is so educational for those with limited exposure to culture." Every word carried the same message. "You don't belong here." I felt the sting of tears but fought them back, refusing to give him the satisfaction. Ethan's hand squeezed mine under the table, but even his quiet strength couldn't shield me completely. And then the slip. Nervous, my hand knocked my wine glass, sending droplets of deep red staining the pristine white tablecloth. I gasped, mortified, as a server rushed to replace it. Ethan leaned close, whispering, "Don't worry, it's nothing." But Richard chuckled loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Careful, Claire. That wine costs more than you probably make in a week." The table went silent. My face burned, my stomach knotted, and for the first time I wondered if he would succeed in breaking me. I didn't know then that this was only the beginning, that his cruelest words were still waiting. The red stain on that perfect white tablecloth felt like a scar I had carved into their world, a mark that proved I didn't belong. My hand trembled as the server dabbed frantically at the cloth, replacing my glass with silent efficiency. All the while, Richard Montgomery leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine with a smirk that made my skin crawl. "Careful," he said, his voice booming across the table. "That bottle costs more than she probably makes in a week." The silence that followed was suffocating. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, a few hiding behind their glasses. Ethan's face flushed crimson, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. "That's enough, father!" He snapped, his voice low but shaking with fury. Richard didn't flinch. His smile widened. "Merely stating facts, son. No need to be so sensitive." Then his eyes returned to me, gleaming with cruel satisfaction, like a predator savoring a cornered prey. I forced myself to take a steady breath, but my chest was on fire. This wasn't just rudeness anymore, it was a performance. Richard wanted an audience, and he wanted to humiliate me in front of it. He set his glass down deliberately, leaning forward so his words would cut deeper. "Tell me, Claire, is that dress from this season's collection? I don't recall seeing anything like it in your mother's wardrobe." I froze. My throat tightened. I could have lied, but I didn't. "It belongs to a friend. She was kind enough to lend it to me." "A borrowed dress?" Richard nodded slowly, his voice dripping with triumph. "I thought as much. Borrowed finery. Street garbage wrapped in silk." The words hit like a slap, echoing across the table. 23 guests stared at me, some with pity, some with thinly veiled glee, others pretending to study their plates. Ethan half rose from his chair, his hand gripping the edge of the table. "Father, if you don't stop—" "Sit down," Richard barked, dismissing him with a flick of his wrist. "If she's going to be part of this world, she'll need thicker skin." I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. The humiliation was total, the trap complete. This was the moment he wanted, the moment I broke. I should have run from the room sobbing, giving him the victory he craved. But something unexpected surged inside me. Instead of collapsing, I felt an almost eerie calm wash over me. Years of being underestimated, years of scraping by years of proving I was more than what the world saw, all of it rose to the surface. I straightened in my seat, smoothed the silk of my borrowed dress, and lifted my chin. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady, clear, and loud enough for every single person in that room to hear. "Street garbage," I repeated softly, savoring the words. "That's an interesting choice, Mr. Montgomery." For a split second, the smugness faltered in his expression. He hadn't expected resistance, not here, not from me. I glanced around the table, locking eyes with guests who quickly looked away and then back to him. "You've actually helped me, Richard. I've been wrestling with a moral dilemma for months, and tonight you've made my decision remarkably easy." Confusion rippled down the table, whispers, rising glasses clinking nervously. Ethan froze beside me, his eyes searching mine. He had no idea what I meant, but I knew. Because this was the turning point. This was the moment when Richard Montgomery, in his arrogance, handed me the one thing I needed most: clarity. And what happened after those words left my lips would change everything. And before I reveal what I did next, let me ask you this. What would you have done if you were in my seat that night? Would you have walked away in silence, or would you have fought back? Drop your thoughts below, because the choice I made shattered the entire room. The room was silent, the kind of silence that feels alive, thrumming in your chest, suffocating your lungs. Every eye was on me, waiting to see if I'd crack under Richard Montgomery's venom. He leaned forward, the chandelier's light, catching the sharp angles of his face, his voice dropping into something meant to cut me open. "Let me be perfectly clear, Miss Claire," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "My son may be amused by slumming it with you for a while, but don't mistake his temporary distraction for permanence. You are nothing but street garbage in a borrowed dress, and you will never belong in this family or this world." The words ricocheted through me, heavy and deliberate. Around the table, forks clinked softly as people shifted uncomfortably, pretending to focus on their plates. Ethan's mother pressed her lips into a thin line, her eyes fixed on her glass of wine. One guest coughed. Another reached for more bread, desperate for some excuse not to meet my gaze. But Ethan wasn't silent. He surged halfway out of his chair, his voice shaking with rage. "Enough, father. You don't get to humiliate her like this." His hand gripped the edge of the table so tightly the veins stood out along his arm. "If you can't show her basic respect—" "Sit down, Ethan," Richard snapped, flicking his hand like he was dismissing a servant. "This is my house, my table. If your guest can't handle a little truth, she doesn't deserve to sit here." For a moment I thought Ethan might actually lunge across the table, the fury in his eyes brighter than I'd ever seen. His whole life he'd been raised in the shadow of this man, and now he was watching his father try to annihilate me with words. But even his anger wasn't what filled me with strength. It was the realization that Richard Montgomery had just revealed everything. This wasn't about me. It never had been. It was about power, about control, about making sure his son never strayed from the gilded cage he'd been raised in. And if crushing me in front of 23 witnesses was what it took to reassert that control, Richard was more than willing to do it. But here's what he didn't know: I wasn't fragile. My entire life had been one long lesson in surviving people who wanted me to feel small. My father's absence, the nights my mother cried over bills, the classmates who mocked me for my thrift store clothes, I had endured it all. And every wound had built armor. I felt that armor now. Instead of collapsing, I stood, slowly, deliberately. My chair scraped against the polished floor, a sound louder than thunder in the hushed room. Every head turned. My borrowed silk gown whispered around my ankles as I rose to my full height. Richard smirked clearly, expecting me to excuse myself in tears. His victory was so close he could taste it. But I didn't move toward the door. I placed my hands lightly on the edge of the table, meeting his cold stare without blinking. My voice, when it came, was calm, almost too calm. "You wanted me broken tonight, Mr. Montgomery. But you've forgotten something important. You don't get to define me. You don't get to tell me where I belong." Ethan's breath caught beside me. Richard's smirk faltered. The guests exchanged glances, sensing a shift in the air. I took a sip of water, steady, deliberate, like I was the one in control now. "You see, when you call me street garbage, you're really telling the world what you fear, that someone like me could walk into this house and expose the rot underneath the marble." The words hung there, daring him to strike back. And though my hands trembled beneath the table, my voice did not waver. This wasn't just defiance. This was the spark before the fire. What Richard and everyone else at that table didn't know was that I had been holding back something far more dangerous than borrowed silk and a steady smile. And in just a moment, I was going to light the match. The match was in my hand, and I could feel the weight of the entire room waiting to see whether I'd strike it. Richard Montgomery sat back in his chair, smug again, convinced his cruelty had left me cornered. But he didn't understand. He'd given me the perfect stage. I lifted my glass of water, took one calm sip, and set it down. Then I smiled. "You know, Mr. Montgomery," I said, my voice carrying to the furthest edge of the dining hall, "I should be thanking you tonight. For months, I've been wrestling with a decision, and you just made it easy." His brow furrowed the first crack in his mask. "What on earth are you babbling about?" "I'm not just a barista, Richard." I straightened, letting the silence hang for effect. "For the past 2 years, I've also been working as an investigative journalist for the Boston Sentinel." Gasps rippled down the table. Forks froze midair. Even Lila's eyes widened as she sat further down the line, her wineglass clinking against the plate. Ethan's hand twitched in mine, his grip tightening, as though he wasn't sure whether to be terrified or proud. Richard's smirk hardened into a mask. "You expect us to believe that he scoffed." "You don't have to believe me," I replied, steady as stone. "But you might want to hear this. 6 months ago, long before I met Ethan, I was part of an investigation into corporate fraud in the shipping industry. Do you know which company's name came up again and again in our documents?" The silence was deafening. "Montgomery Global," I said clearly, my eyes locked on his. "And more specifically, yours, Mr. Montgomery." Color drained from his face. For the first time, the predator looked human. "We uncovered falsified environmental reports, evidence of illegal waste dumping in protected waters, bribes to inspectors in 3 countries, a sophisticated system to cover it all up. And do you know what?" I leaned forward slightly. "The evidence has your signature on it." A glass shattered somewhere down the table. Richard slammed his hand against the wood, rising halfway to his feet. "This is outrageous, Lies. If you think you can smear my name in front of my family..." I cut him off, calm, deliberate. I removed myself from the story when I realized who Ethan was. I disclosed the conflict to my editor. I even begged them to delay publication to avoid tainting him with your crimes. But the evidence is real. Photographs of you meeting inspectors on your yacht. Recordings of your executives discussing how to hide toxic waste. Documents you signed. The room erupted in whispers. Guests leaned toward each other, horrified, fascinated. Ethan's grandmother pressed a trembling hand to her chest. His grandfather's expression turned to stone. Richard sputtered, "This is slander. I'll sue you and your paper into the ground." "You're welcome to try," I said, my voice sharper now. "But the Sentinel's lawyers have already vetted every word, every image, every recording. The story has been ready to run for 3 months, and until tonight, I held it back. Richard's face turned a dangerous shade of red, his knuckles white as he gripped the table. Why would they listen to some coffee shop girl? Because I'm the one who gathered the key evidence, I answered, my voice ringing with conviction. Because truth doesn't care where you come from, Mr. Montgomery. And because despite what you think, garbage can hold fire. I reached into my clutch, pulled out my phone, and tapped a quick message to my editor. When I looked back up, my smile was cold. That was me officially removing my objection. Tonight at midnight, the investigation goes live, with your name in the headline. The silence snapped, replaced by chaos. Guests rose, muttering excuses. Lila stared at me with a mixture of shock and awe. Ethan's mother clutched his arm, her face pale. Richard roared, "You little nothing! Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" But I stood tall, unshaken. Yes, a man who finally met someone he couldn't buy silence or break. And in that moment, for the first time all night, I wasn't the one on trial. He was. For a moment after my words, the Montgomery dining room looked less like a celebration and more like a courtroom. The air was electric, the guests frozen between disbelief and scandal, as though they were afraid that even breathing too loudly might implicate them. Then the chaos erupted. People began pushing their chairs back, some whispering frantically to one another, others muttering excuses as they rose from the table. The crystal clink of glasses and hurried shuffling of expensive shoes echoed off the marble floor. A woman in pearls gasped, clutching her husband's arm, while a young cousin stared at me like I'd just detonated a bomb in the middle of their empire. Richard Montgomery's roar cut through it all. "You think you can come into my home and destroy me in front of my family? You will regret this, you insolent girl." He shoved his chair back so hard it toppled, wine spilling like blood across the tablecloth. I didn't flinch. I typed one last confirmation into my phone and slipped it back into my clutch. Too late. The decision's already made. The story runs at midnight. "You liar!" His face was purple now, veins bulging at his temples. "You're using my son, manipulating him just to get close enough to tear us down. Admit it." I shook my head calm, even as my knees trembled. "No, Richard. I fell in love with Ethan despite his name, not because of it. If anything, I tried to protect him. But you've given me no choice. You tried to bury me under your contempt, and instead you've uncovered the truth." Ethan finally stood, fully positioning himself between us. His voice cracked with rage. "Enough, you will not speak to her like that. Not now, not ever again." "Can't you see what she's done, you fool?" Richard spat his finger, stabbing the air toward me. "She's poisoned this family. Everything I built, everything you stand to inherit, she's burning it to the ground." Ethan's voice dropped low and firm. "Then maybe it deserves to burn." The gasp that rippled down the table was louder than the earlier whispers. For the first time, I saw fear flicker across Richard's face, not fear of me, but of his own son finally stepping out of his shadow. And then Henry Montgomery, Ethan's grandfather, rose slowly at the head of the table. At 84, he still carried himself with a presence that commanded the room. His voice, though calm, was laced with steel. "Richard, my office, now." The patriarch's words struck harder than any shout. Richard sputtered, then stormed from the room, his wife Evelyn trailing after him, her face pale and pinched. As the doors closed behind them, silence settled again, broken only by the distant clatter of departing guests. Lila stepped closer to me, her expression torn between shock and admiration. "Well," she whispered, "I think you just made this the most memorable anniversary dinner in Montgomery history." Ethan turned to me, his eyes full of conflicting emotions, pride, fear, heartbreak. "Claire, we need to talk, but not here, not tonight." I nodded, my throat tight. "Call me tomorrow, if you still want to." I gathered my things, my hands steady, even though my heart felt like shattered glass. At the door, Ethan's grandmother intercepted me, taking both my hands in hers. "My dear," she said softly, "you showed courage tonight that no one in this family has shown in decades. Whatever happens, remember this truth may hurt, but lies rot everything they touch." Her words were both balm and burden, because as I stepped out into the cool night, leaving the glittering mansion behind, I knew I had won a battle, but I wasn't sure if I had lost the man I loved. And what came next when the headlines hit the world would prove that victory comes with a price. But tell me, if you were in my place, would you have stayed to fight beside Ethan's family or walked away as I did? Let me know in the comments, because sometimes the hardest part of telling the truth is watching who it breaks. The headlines dropped at midnight just as I promised. By dawn, they were everywhere, splashed across news websites, whispered in podcasts, scrolling across the bottom of every cable channel. Montgomery Global accused of massive environmental fraud. My name appeared beneath the title alongside two senior reporters, and with that, my life changed. The following morning, I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat in my apartment with the blinds half closed, the glow of my laptop casting long shadows across the room. My phone buzzed relentlessly, calls from my editor, congratulations from colleagues, messages from strangers on social media, calling me brave, some even calling me reckless. By 8 a.m., the story had gone national. By noon, Montgomery Global's stock had dropped 20%. By evening, the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Justice had announced preliminary investigations. On paper, it was the biggest professional victory of my life. But none of it felt like triumph. Because through the endless calls and messages, one name never lit up my screen: Ethan. Every buzz made my heart leap, only to sink seconds later, when it was yet another unknown number or colleague. For 3 days, silence from him was louder than all the noise outside. I replayed the dinner in my head 100 times, his face, his fury, the shock in his eyes, when I revealed the truth. Had I destroyed him too? And yet while my heart cracked, the world celebrated or devoured the story. My editor called me into the newsroom on the second day. "You did it," he said, gripping my shoulder. "This piece will define your career." Other journalists congratulated me, some with admiration, others with thinly veiled envy. Offers began pouring in from national outlets, magazines, even television producers. Everyone wanted the girl who took down Richard Montgomery. But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt hollow. Because I hadn't just exposed a corporation, I had detonated a bomb in Ethan's life. And the shrapnel I feared might have cut through the very love I was trying to protect. Still, the fallout couldn't be ignored. Montgomery Global reeled. Entire divisions of the company were frozen, employees unsure if they would even have jobs the next week. Friends texted me screenshots of news anchors speculating about criminal charges. And while I knew Richard deserved to face justice, the collateral damage the families who depended on those paychecks gnawed at me. On the third day, exhausted and desperate for normalcy, I put on my cafe apron and returned to work. The bell above the door jingled as customers came in, some doing double takes when they recognized me from the news. My manager pulled me aside, her voice low with concern. "Are you sure you want to be here? Reporters have been asking about you." "I need something ordinary," I whispered. "Something that reminds me who I am." But even there, in the hum of the espresso machine, I couldn't escape it. Around 11 a.m., the door opened and the cafe went silent. It was Richard Montgomery. He didn't look like the imperious man from the dinner table. His tailored suit was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, his posture hunched. The mighty billionaire looked diminished. He ordered no coffee. He simply said a word, in private. The cafe froze. My manager stepped forward, protective. "If you're here to harass my employee—" "It's okay," I interrupted, forcing calm into my voice. "I'll take my break." We sat at a corner table, the tension thick. He stared at me across the small formica surface, and for the first time I saw a crack in his armor. His voice was gravel. "I underestimated you." I almost laughed. "Most people do. That's my curse and my advantage." His jaw tightened. "My lawyers say your reporting is factually accurate. Selectively presented, but accurate. A lawsuit would only feed the fire." I leaned forward. "So what do you want from me, Richard? An apology, because you won't get it." He shook his head slowly. "No. I came to ask what it would take to make you back off. Money, a position, name your price." My stomach turned. Even after being exposed, he still thought the world revolved around transactions, that everyone had a price. He didn't understand that sometimes the only currency that mattered was truth. And though I stared into the eyes of a fallen giant, one thought pulsed through my mind: I might have destroyed Richard Montgomery's empire. But in doing so, I might also have lost Ethan forever. And that's where I want to leave you with a question. Would you have done it? Would you have pressed send, knowing it might cost you the one person you loved most? Drop your thoughts below, because this is where my story takes a turn. Even I didn't see coming. That evening, as I chopped vegetables in my cramped little kitchen, there was a knock at my door. For 3 days, I'd been holding my breath, waiting, hoping and terrified that it would be him. When I opened it, there stood Ethan. He looked nothing like the man I had known at the cafe counter or on our river walks. His suit was gone, replaced by a wrinkled shirt. His usually neat hair was unkempt, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He stood there silently for a moment, then finally said, "Hi." My throat tightened. "Hi," I whispered back. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside, and he entered like someone carrying the weight of the world. For a few seconds we just stood there, the silence between us heavy with everything unsaid. Then at the exact same time we both blurted out, "I should have told you. I should have called." We both stopped staring. Then faintly a ghost of a smile crossed his lips. "Ladies first." I swallowed hard. "I should have told you about the investigation. I convinced myself I was protecting you, that you didn't need to face the impossible choice between me and your family. But the truth is I was scared of losing you." He nodded slowly, eyes cast downward. "And I should have called sooner. I needed time, Claire. Time to process, to confront him, to see it with my own eyes." I dared to ask, "And did you—" "Yes." His voice was low-pained. "The evidence is irrefutable. Everything your article claimed and more. I accessed files, internal reports, emails that even your team didn't find. He did it all, Claire. Every violation, every cover-up. I thought I knew my father. I thought at the very least he built his empire with integrity. But I was wrong." He ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head. "My whole life I defended him. I told myself he was harsh, but fair, cruel, but principled. And now he's just cruel." I gestured toward the couch, and we both sat, keeping a small, careful space between us. "Where have you been these past 3 days?" I asked softly. "A hotel, meeting with company lawyers, talking to my grandfather about what happens next. And—" He finally looked at me, his eyes raw, vulnerable, thinking about us. My heart clenched. "And what conclusion did you reach?" He drew a shaky breath. "That I fell in love with a woman braver than I ever realized. A woman who stood up to him in a way I never had the courage to. But also that I'm angry. Angry you didn't trust me enough to share the truth sooner. Angry that you thought you had to carry it alone." Tears stung my eyes. "I'm sorry. I thought I was sparing you. But you're right, I should have trusted you." "And I'm sorry," he replied, his hand finally reaching for mine. "Sorry I let you endure his cruelty without standing stronger by your side. Sorry I didn't see him clearly until it was too late." We sat there, fingers entwined, the silence stretching, but no longer suffocating. "My family is fractured," Ethan said quietly. "My mother refuses to speak to me. She stands by him. Lila thinks I did the right thing, but she's alone in that. My grandfather has stepped back in to stabilize the company, but the Montgomery name may never recover." "And you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What do you want to do?" "I resigned," he said simply. "I walked away from Montgomery Global. I won't be part of what he built. Instead, I'm starting something new, something honest, something that might heal the damage." He leaned closer, his voice softer now. "But I don't want to do it alone. I still love you, Claire. That hasn't changed. The question is, do you still love me enough to try again? To rebuild slowly with no lies, no shadows?" I stared into his eyes, seeing not the heir to a billionaire, but the man who ordered black coffee with 1 sugar, who had once told me I was stronger than I knew. The man who looked at me like I wasn't small, like I wasn't out of place, like I wasn't garbage. "I do," I whispered, "more than anything." And for the first time since that disastrous dinner, hope flickered back to life. The months that followed felt like walking through the wreckage of a storm, messy, uncertain, but with the faint promise of sunlight on the horizon. The Montgomery scandal consumed headlines for weeks. Federal agencies launched full investigations, and Richard Montgomery himself was eventually indicted on charges of fraud, bribery, and repeated violations of the Clean Water Act. The empire he had ruled with an iron fist crumbled before the eyes of the public. For me, the exposure brought both triumph and torment. Professionally, my life transformed overnight. I was no longer the girl from the cafe. I was a journalist whose byline appeared on the biggest corporate exposé of the year. Job offers poured in, invitations to panels, interviews, even a book deal. My editor told me, "Claire, you've redefined your career. You'll never be invisible again." But success came with a cost. Every time I saw the stock ticker plummet, or read about employees losing jobs, I felt the weight of guilt. People who had nothing to do with Richard's corruption were paying the price. I reminded myself again and again that the blame wasn't mine. That truth isn't responsible for the sins it reveals, but the heaviness never quite left. Ethan carried his own burden. He walked away from Montgomery Global, refusing to inherit an empire built on lies. Instead, he launched a foundation focused on ethical business practices and environmental restoration. He funneled his personal savings into rehiring former employees displaced by the scandal, giving them meaningful work again. "I can't undo what my father did," he told me one evening, "but I can create something better from the ashes." Watching him rebuild, not with arrogance, but with humility, made me love him more fiercely than ever. Our relationship wasn't easy. Trust had to be stitched back together slowly. We had nights filled with long conversations, painful admissions, and sometimes silence when words weren't enough. But every step forward was honest, and that honesty became our anchor. Not everyone in his family supported us. Ethan's mother, Evelyn, refused to acknowledge me at all. She stood by her husband through every court appearance, her face a mask of icy loyalty. But his sister Lila became my unlikely ally, telling me over coffee, "You've got more backbone than anyone who sat at that table in 20 years. You tore open the bubble we were all too comfortable living in." Most surprising of all were Henry and Eleanor, Ethan's grandparents. They reached out, inviting us to lunch a month after the scandal broke. Henry, voice heavy with disappointment, said, "We built this company with integrity." Somewhere along the way, Richard forgot what that meant. "You forced a reckoning, Claire. Painful, yes, but necessary." Eleanor clasped my hand gently. Sometimes it takes an outsider to remind us of our values. 8 months after the infamous dinner, Richard requested one final meeting. By then he was a shadow of the man who had once sneered at me across the mahogany table. His lawyers had arranged a plea deal, and prison loomed. In a sterile conference room, he looked at me with hollow eyes. "I underestimated you. I was wrong about you." He said the closest to an apology his pride allowed. It didn't erase the cruelty of that night, but it closed a chapter. As for me, I embraced the life I'd never thought possible. I testified before congressional committees, spoke about corporate accountability, even began writing a book on the hidden cost of unchecked power. And yet through it all, I kept my feet grounded in the lessons of where I came from, the girl who once chose between textbooks and electricity bills, the woman who stood in borrowed silk and refused to bow. On the 1-year anniversary of our first date, Ethan took me back to that same little Italian restaurant. After dinner, as we walked along the Charles River, the same place he had first told me he loved me, he stopped, turned to me, and said softly, "My father once called you street garbage. But you showed me what true worth looks like. You taught me that empires built on lies fall, but love built on truth can withstand anything." We stood under the stars hand in hand, knowing the journey ahead would never be simple, but it would be ours. And that night I realized something profound. Sometimes the insults meant to break you become the spark that sets you free. If you've ever had a moment where someone tried to reduce you and you rose higher instead, I want to hear your story. Share it below. And if this one moved, you stay with me, because the next story I'll share will prove that resilience isn't just survival, it's power. When I look back now, it's hard to believe how much changed because of one dinner, one insult, one moment when I was expected to crumble. That night, Richard Montgomery thought he could strip me down with words, reduce me to nothing more than street garbage in a borrowed dress. What he didn't realize was that those words lit a fire I'd been carrying for years. The fire of every setback I'd survived, every time I was underestimated, every time I fought harder just to stay standing. Exposing the truth came with a price. I lost the illusion of safety. I lost the version of Ethan untouched by scandal. I carried the weight of knowing people suffered consequences I never wanted them to face. But I also gained something unshakable, a voice that could no longer be silenced and a love that had been tested in fire and endured. Ethan and I built our future not on inherited wealth or glossy reputations, but on the hard foundation of honesty. We moved into a modest apartment decorated with mismatched furniture and sketches pinned on the walls. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And every time we walked along the river together, we were reminded that truth, no matter how painful, is the only ground worth standing on. So here's what I've learned and what I hope you take with you. Your worth is never defined by someone else's table, their name, or their opinion of you. It is defined by your choices, your integrity, and your courage to stand tall when others want you small. Sometimes it takes being called garbage to realize you are gold, and maybe, just maybe, that's the lesson we all need.